Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much, Dr. So. Thank you for so much. I am so personally thrilled to continue with this fifth iteration of the Unafraid Symposium. This year's theme, as you know, is academic excellence, public responsibility, and theological formation. PSR is committed to fostering excellence in academic work, tempered with empathy and concern for diverse audiences, while honoring the work of our ancestors, scholars, who have left us legacies of creativity, critique, vision, and revisioning. Precisely because we are committed to our communities, both local and global, to communities of birth and communities of choice, we attempt to do theology in a public way, queering the binaries of private and public, sacred and secular, religious and spiritual. One of the ways in which we do this is to commit to lifelong theological formation. Every single member of our community here at PSR enacts this commitment for themselves, for their communities, and for their whole lives. We know as we change and grow that our ideas about ourselves, about others, about the world at large, about creation, and finally about God, ideas which can be rightly called ideas of ultimate concern, in the words of the famous theologian Paul Tillich. These ideas change, must change, and reflect the growth we are embarked on. Change in this way can be personally challenging and disruptive, but ultimately it serves to create resilience, it creates a context of creativity, and finally it permits us to repristinate our understanding and our commitment to the world at large. There is much more that I can say, and I could go on, but I am so eager to hear what our students and what our faculty have to share with you. So I'm going to keep my remarks very, very brief here today. I know it might be a little bit strange to start thanking people even before an event has begun, but I want to start with deep, deep gratitude for what is going to be on offer today for all of you. I'm grateful for the work of so many people. Well, first of all, the vision of a faculty 5 years ago that, in a very unafraid way, said, let's do this. Let's celebrate the work that our students do. Let's celebrate our collective intellectual and spiritual work together. So 5 years ago, we embarked on a small program, which now has become a mainstay of our academic offerings here at PSR. Therefore, I would like to thank very much the 23 students who sent in 26 proposals for the faculty to consider. This is amazing output from our students and represents intellectual and spiritual creativity to an extent that I could not have imagined 5 years ago. Of those 26 proposals, 9 were chosen to present today. So you can imagine the level of competition and the level of excellence that is represented in our student panels. They represent the best of us at PSR. We are absolutely a community that is devoted to learning together. Deep gratitude here to President David, who has supported this effort for many, many years, to the faculty as a whole, and especially the faculty panel who is present and who will respond to our presenters. I'm especially grateful for the support and help of the Office of Academic Affairs, especially Laura Ryan, who's a repository of our collective intelligence for this program and many other things behind the scenes, as you all know. I would be entirely remiss if I forgot beloved Matthew in the background, making sure the tech works. Matthew, we cannot even remember a time before you. Please be there, always. Thank you so much for all that you do for us. Finally, and with great appreciation, I really want to recognize the incredible work done by Dr. Yunhei So in the middle of many personal and other professional, I don't want to say challenges, I want to say opportunities for development that all happened in this past few months. As you know, Dr. So was awarded her doctorate very recently, and she did all this as she was preparing and making plans for the Unafraid Symposium. This is an enormous achievement. It's an enormous achievement of personal, intellectual, and spiritual vigor. I want to thank and recognize the strength that you bring to our community. So thank you for your meticulous attention to detail, which has curated this wonderful experience that we are all going to embark on. And thank you all who are present here as our audience. Please enjoy the fruits of a great learning community here at the Pacific School of Religion. Thank you so very much, everyone.
Thank you, Dean Abraham. I really appreciate your keynote address. Our first presenter is also very excited to share. Our first presenter is Jayna Acosta, and she will be sharing from the excerpt from Experimenting with Ethical Unknowings in the Absence of Discourse, Pornographic Elephants in Christian Rooms. I welcome Jayna.
Thank you, and good morning. Foreplay. My queer motive in this work is to explore, wander, and provoke, but not necessarily to argue for a particular ethical conclusion, which I acknowledge is at best unorthodox and at worst a slippery move to make when charged with the creation of an academic paper for an Introduction to Christian Ethics course. So I ask you, dear listeners, to tolerate that this work is more of a mischievous experiment than structured argument, and to indulge that it is useful to veer off the clearly designated colonial road and curiously cruise the back streets of lived contextual geographies in our pursuit of juicy ethical fruit. In this spirit, and with my combined love of and exasperation with the conserving constraints of academic language, I will intentionally cross boundaries, mixing academic form with sexual desire to the entirely intentional point of pornographic expression. I am curious, and I have cautious hope that liberative climaxes could come at exactly such crossings, for there is activating power in transgressing boundaries policed by our frigid authorities, especially the boundaries separating theology and sexuality. My hope is that this paper generates an erotic provocation, arousing listeners from chaste knowing toward an intuited queer erotic horizon, spreading open liberative contextual theologies desired but still unnamed. And what will follow is an excerpt from a longer paper entitled Experimenting with Ethical Unknowings in the Absence of Discourse, Pornographic Elephants in Christian Rooms. Texts that thrill. The rumor that Jesus did not have sex pulls and teases my attention. I trace what I want onto his body, brown and warm, short and muscular, feminine here, masculine there. His nose is broad with ovular nostrils like Janie's. Her bottom lip could be his. His thick, good flesh embarrasses me because public desire is vulnerable. Weakly, I place him into my mouth amid a room full of his lovers. So what does an ethically shaky Christian, kinked with arousal by the conspicuously enforced silence around the most carnal genre of her time, write about at the end of a semester of Introduction to Christian Ethics? Blushing and hot, I disclosed that there were two theologians who laid me down into more receptive position of this girthy Christian dilemma. Their voices are different and delicious in the mouth that is my mind. In Marcella Altheus Reed's introduction, The Fragrance of Women's Liberation Theology, Odors of Sex and Lemons in the Streets of Buenos Aires, the invitation is to enter into perverse delights with unapologetic imprudence to change courses previously set, and I accept. She insists the discourse lift its skirt, and although academics are systemically molded to keep our discourses conserving, carefully laying qualifying towels down when working with texts that squirt, Altheus Reed is coming for us, and she does not let us draw up the prudish covers of our academic sheets, woven with 1,000 count syntax and designed to keep us from touching directly what we want, but are too ashamed to ask for. Her theology is so immediate, so intimate that we can practically smell it in her words when she proclaims that, quote, the Virgin Mary is overdressed, and contrary to the lemon vendors, the smell of her sex, even if statues were alive, would be difficult to perceive. What Altheus Reed does, and she does a lot of things, but among one of her finest transgressions is her assurance that it is not just theologians who do theology. No, theology is also conducted by the people the theological authorities obsess over, the ones they are grinding out doctrine aimed at, and which is designed to control the economy of their objectified bodies, specifically their sexualities. She reveals, quote, the outcome of the destruction of the grand meta-narratives of Latin American high civilizations can be seen in the everyday lives of women, such as the lemon vendors and the women theologians in the streets of Buenos Aires. Altheus Reed is not afraid to center the margins, and she is not polite about it. Furthermore, she has no hesitation to combine the sensual with the divine. There will be no pious prisoners in this theology. Her offense appeals, if only because I am at the end of a rope in some ways, perhaps the ways we call praxis. I admire so much her willingness to disrupt, but I impatiently wonder about all written theologies. What is it that our words actually disrupt? And moreover, who really does benefit? I naughtily wonder, is it ethically sound to write words into a manner and amid a space where academics and theologians might wander, lay eyes upon them, and have them penetrate deep into their own psyches, even without first knowing the girth of the knowledge and the speed at which it would enter? Epistemologies are not really about consent, are they? The justifiable impact being potentially a turn toward liberative thinking and praxis change in accordance with it. But is this really the impact of the well-worded but compartmentalized academic work of such Christians as us? I love words, and I am so tired of them. The heretical size queen complains about how tiny some Christian thought is. Christian thoughts are often small. My mind hole is wide and deep. From where has and will my desired knowledge come? Whose thoughts are lodged inside me as I write this? I have been so promiscuous with my mind. How many are inside me now? I flutter my eyelashes demurely. I know that most of what I think isn't my biote. Thinking my own thoughts isn't as exciting as opening my head wide to what you could write into me. My theology is a silky pillowcase full of forbidden stories stuffed under the bed of my psyche. So many. I like the way ideas feel as they move inside the space behind my eyes. The more I have to stretch my ideology around you, the greater my thrill. When I read your words, I can't measure how deep you penetrate me. And even now, as you listen to this, where am I? I am not outside of you. The second thrilling text I wish to confess my lust for is the work of Thomas LaCour, who subversively flips the center of the discourse in Making Love Just. He talks back to Christianity, the longtime bully of sexual outsiders and subordinated insiders, with luscious top energy. His strategy not to defend from the location of the margin, but to calmly take the center, flipping the former with genuine empathy and authentic concern, calling them into an on your knees repentance that consists of a lifetime commitment to listen to those they marginalized. This is the turning of the tables I have often yearned for, but never heard so erotically articulated. That former arrogant top full of brusque talk and all of those stiff and inelegant expressions of power has never been so quickly flipped on his back and fucked with such firm, insistent, and loving care. Art. I am hungry for the work of such writers, and I shamelessly spread the lips of my mind wide open around their words. It is good, and in rooms all by myself, I sluttily take their thinking into my head. But what does one do communally? What is the praxis for these words in the world, these words and my indecent responses to them in a community of faith? On this entirely compartmentalized point on the timeline, where there is a language for this and a language for that, but no place where the two or more are welcome to mingle, what would a community that speaks out of and into a world where the erotic and the Christian, the pornographic and the pastoral live in spaces that don't stay in the containers designed by de-erotic powers to keep them from touching? To put this another way, Matthias Reed says, quote, "A queer theologian would like to go further. It is not enough to open, for instance, a theological reflection on masturbation, using masturbation as the motive of an ecclesiastical or eschatological concern, like, are masturbators going to be among the elect, but rather to think Christian eschatology from an epistemology derived from masturbation," end quote. And so having something expanding in my hand, something groped for, but which I don't yet have the engorged words to slide inside my lister's head, I can only take a running naked jump at the space my indecent ancestor calls me into. A masturbatologic epistemology and the eschatological hope it makes come. I spread myself open because I left hell in the pocket of my skirt, and my body knows that hell will not survive the wash. God inflates and I am stretched more than I can be. God vibrates and I come into that place where she and I agree. We don't have to create each other anymore. There is nothing left to be eaten. No sacrifices left behind to wonder about its worth. Satisfied, we let me die very well. And my not so little death surpasses even that one warm summer night, that long evening together in the dark. A paper written in an introduction to Christian ethics course around a topic such as pornography could be reasonably expected to name pornography's real harms against persons and then well argue against its consumption, but it is consumed. And reaching back to that insistence of Matthias Reed that the everyday lives of people always provide us with a starting point for a process of doing contextual theology without exclusions, I don't want to let go of this sense that pornography, as part of the sexual lives of everyday people, has theological content that isn't limited to narratives of correction regarding harm and consumption. I intuitively and queerly grope toward additional space that I want to move through. It isn't a space of for or against. It is a location of being in and traveling. Not through the concerns well argued at the feet of a colonial father, but rather into what is and what could be in the lap of a woman whose name I don't yet know, but whose hands I have caught glimpses of, and whose thick fingers make me wonder with submissive desire if it isn't possible that everything I have ever thought is wrong.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Jayna. I would like to warmly welcome our next presenter, Lavjay Butani. Lavjay will be speaking about his paper, The Repeated Violations of Ahalya and the Perpetuation of Hegemonic Revisionism. We welcome you, Lavjay.
Thank you, Dr. So, and good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Ahalya. Some stories are never told. Others are told countless times, across generations, across languages, and across traditions. And in the retelling, they change. Sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes dramatically, sometimes in ways that silence, and sometimes, though not often enough, in ways that challenge the very systems that silence. In these retellings, heroes can become villains, victims can become sinners, and voices that were once heard can disappear altogether. So as I begin, I invite you to think about when we ourselves, either intentionally or inadvertently, may have silenced others through the stories we have told. And today I want to explore this question through a single story, that of Ahalya, and through the story of this beautiful woman, I would encourage us to reflect on the intersections of interpretation, power, and responsibility. And so I plan on doing this in three phases. First, I will define two key terms, hermeneusis and revisionism. Secondly, I will examine the story of Ahalya and how it has been retold. And then lastly, through reflecting on why this story matters today. So first, a distinction. To me, hermeneusis is the process of interpreting a text within its historical and cultural context in order to understand its meaning, or I should say, multiple meanings. Revisionism, on the other hand, is the reshaping of a narrative. Sometimes that happens in light of new perspectives, but more often in ways that reinforce particular ideologies. And beware, for the line between the two can be thin. And in that thin line operate power and responsibility. Ahalya's story appears in the Ramayana, which is an ancient Indian epic. Her name literally means undefiled or unplowed. Ahalya is described as a woman of extraordinary beauty. She is created by the gods and is married off to the sage Gautama, who is an ascetic and who is much older than her. One day, Indra, who is the god of the heavens, desires her sexually. And so he disguises himself as her husband and approaches her. What happens next depends on the version of the story you read and the version you choose to believe in. In some versions, Ahalya is deceived. She believes Indra is her husband. In others, she recognizes the deception, but that happens too late. In yet others, she knows, and she chooses to be a part of the encounter, driven by longing, driven by the neglect by her husband, and driven by her unfulfilled sexual desire. When her husband Gautama discovers what has happened, he curses them both. Indra is punished, but Ahalya's punishment is more severe. In some versions of the story, she becomes invisible, and in others, she is turned to stone. And in all versions, she is condemned to silence, stillness, and isolation. A voice that remains silenced until she is quote unquote redeemed by the touch of Ram, the hero of the epic. So what's most striking is this. The question that storytellers over time have retold, or I would say manipulated, is this: who is responsible? Some of the earlier tellings leave room for ambiguity. Was she deceived? Was she complicit? Was she violated? But later retellings increasingly place the burden on Ahalya herself, and she becomes a warning, a moral lesson, and a symbol of fallen womanhood. Her body actually becomes a playground where social control is exercised, especially around female sexuality. This is what we might call hegemonic revisionism, the reshaping of a story to reinforce dominant social and patriarchal structures, which in this case were the Hindu Brahminical culture of the time. Across many versions of the story, we see the recurring dynamics of a woman defined by purity and shame, of a man's desire reframed as divine action, of punishment that disciplines female agency, and of redemption that depends on male intervention. Even the image of Ahalya as stone becomes symbolic for the erasure of a voice, of a body, and of a soul. So, why does this matter? It matters because this is not just about an ancient story. It matters because the same dynamics are at work today. It matters because those who control the narrative control meaning making. It matters because even today, some voices are heard and many more are silenced. We continue to see how narratives are reshaped to serve power in the rewriting of our shameful histories of enslavement, in the reformulation of our laws to marginalize and actually invalidate identities, and in the distortion of contemporary knowledge and ancient wisdom as we deny the damage that we are doing to our children and to the environment through the manipulation of scientific evidence. There's also a deeper spiritual challenge here, and that is that we often see the world not as it is, but as we are. We interpret from where we stand. And in doing so, we risk mistaking our perspective for the sole truth. We fail to see the divine in the other because we are too busy projecting ourselves onto them. But wait, the story does not end here. There is hope. There's hope through counter-narratives that, unafraid, revel in retellings that resist domination and reclaim dignity. In some contemporary versions, Ahalya is reimagined and lifted up as a victim of deception, not guilt. Her silence is seen as resistance, not shame. Her desire is acknowledged as human, not sinful. And her story becomes one of agency, not punishment. Some retellings even invert the narrative. The deceiver is punished, the woman is restored without shame, and the focus shifts from purity to personhood. And these retellings do something powerful. They give Ahalya her voice back. And in doing so, these stories remind us always to ask, whose voices have been missing all along? This matters deeply because humans are hermeneutic beings. We tell stories, we teach texts, we shape meaning, and therefore we have power. And we face a choice on how we will and can use this power. So in summary, if we learn anything from Ahalya's story, it is this, that interpretation carries power. And so as we encounter those, especially those whose voices have been marginalized, we are called to listen differently, to listen with humility, to listen with curiosity, and to listen with reverence, not to defend our narratives, not to correct or control, but to understand, always respecting alterity. Because every person carries a story, a truth that is real, and all too often these truths have been rewritten, distorted, or silenced. So I leave you with this. Let us remember that there are many Ahalyas in our world. And as we go forth, let us commit to listen not to respond, but to understand. Listen not for what confirms our worldview, but for what challenges it. And listen especially for the voices that have long been turned to stone. Because our task is not to speak for them, but to help create the conditions in which they can finally speak for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavjay. Our next presenter is Reverend Rachael Pryor, who will be speaking about public theology in long-term disaster recovery. Reverend Rachael, we warmly welcome you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to share in this panel conversation. My presentation for this panel on sermons as public theology is rooted mostly in my direct experience of preaching on an almost weekly basis in my role as a conference minister. So I hope to describe the balance of pastoral and public sensitivity that I found to be at the heart of effective public theology in worship settings, using a recent example from a sermon I delivered around the 1-year anniversary of the destruction of the Altadena Community Church in the January 2025 Los Angeles wildfires. And a handout is available that includes the entire text of the sermon if you want to look at that at another time. I will focus on 3 primary themes today: context, messaging, and agency. When we introduce sensitive or prophetic themes into public worship or prayer or spiritual practice, there's no element more important than understanding the context in which the remarks will be given, both of the speaker and the community. And this is especially true in disaster recovery settings, where, as those who spend their careers in recovery work will tell you, if you've seen one disaster, you've seen one disaster. As in other experiences of grief, disaster survivors are not necessarily interested in the dynamics of other similar disasters. They are understandably focused on their own experience as they rebuild a narrative for what is happening in their lives. This is no less true in Altadena for reasons relating to economics, infrastructure, municipal boundaries, and the overlapping major crises of the racially motivated militarization of immigration and customs enforcement, leading to extrajudicial disappearances and family separations in that community. When I relate to our local church in Altadena, I try to be especially conscientious of local dynamics and narratives. In my context, I am the conference minister of the Southern California Nevada Conference of the United Church of Christ, which covers the 10 southernmost counties of California, as well as Clark County, Nevada. My primary portfolio includes organizational vision and direction, public witness, and pastoral care for clergy. I'm also the disaster coordinator for the conference. As a conference minister, I don't have the kind of power people associate with bishops, but that doesn't mean I don't have any authority. I have the personal authority I build up with people as a result of building relationships and proof of competence. I have the authority to champion or ignore a cause or request. I have access to grants and scholarships. I have the ear of our governing board. This element of my role is especially significant in our denominational support pathways for disaster recovery. In a tradition that emphasizes equality and autonomy, we can do harm when we don't recognize the hierarchy and influence that we wield, often in invisible ways. We can easily turn a faithful partnership into a source of conflict or injustice. And all of this impacts the way an expression of public theology will be received in a local setting. Altadena Community Church is an aging but determined congregation, one of the very first open and affirming churches in the United Church of Christ, a multi-ethnic, multiracial church with strong ties to the surrounding community. The current sanctuary is a small chapel that has seen better days in a neighboring congregation. Altadena's real home is now a bare piece of land with a single surviving tree at the center. About a third of the members lost their homes too. 2 weeks before the sermon I'm referencing, I attended the 1-year anniversary service of the fire. It was meaningful in that context that I had visited the community and met with the leadership throughout the year since the fire. At this anniversary service, I listened as people spoke about their hopes and their grief and the tension between the two. One story made its way into my sermon, the story of a church member who still has a ring full of keys to the burned church and who can't bear to throw them out. Others shared updates about rebuilding their homes and about their ongoing projects in the wider community. I don't usually get to have this much information about a community before I show up to preach. I do the best I can to prepare for every setting, but with 125 congregations, there's only so much I can do. However, I've also learned that it would be unfaithful and irresponsible for me to show up with a predetermined political message. Public theology is most effective when the message is something that can be heard well and received by the community. I try to be cautious about fitting the message to what I know of the community instead of imposing a message I might personally feel motivated to give. This is a good segue to the second point about messaging. My own sense of connecting message and context for the best reception by the community was primarily developed doing faith-based advocacy with a really outstanding and in fact impactful organization called Kansas Interfaith Action, or KIFA. KIFA is a multi-faith statewide advocacy organization that informs and activates faith communities and individuals to navigate the legislative process in Kansas around topics related to social, economic, and environmental justice issues. Through my work with KIFA, I learned, primarily through trial and error, to develop strategies for introducing the concept of faith-based advocacy and the organization's vision to the communities I was visiting. And early on, I learned that trying to talk about everything all at once was overwhelming for these communities who are often brand new to the concept of faith-based advocacy, let alone the labyrinth of the Kansas legislative process. It was more effective to focus on one or two issues that directly affected the host community, and also to give them one or two phrases that could ground their understanding of advocacy as a part of their pre-existing mission and their spiritual identity. Context and messaging come together in the opening paragraph of my sermon, referencing some local experiences, which will be fairly obvious as I share it here. If you have been paying any attention at all to the news lately, you might have spent some time thinking about walls. Walls of detention centers, shrouding in mystery the identities and condition of those detained or kidnapped. Walls of bodies, of protesters and also of police, some with shields or trucks creating another layer of separation. Walls of homes and buildings sandbagged against flooding and mudslides. Imagined lines on a redesigned floor plan. Arguments with lawyers and insurance companies and surveyors about easements and hazard zones and landscaping. Already at this point in the sermon, I've made some significant political statements, but I've framed them simply as observations about public life and the direct experience of the people I'm talking to. After further developing themes of walls and boundaries, I shift the narrative to doors and keys by introducing scripture. In Matthew's gospel, it's in chapter 16, that Jesus says to Simon, son of Jonah, "I tell you that you are Peter, and I'll build my church on this rock. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Anything you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. Anything you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven." The story that follows of the earliest disciple of Jesus in the book we call the Acts of the Apostles is one of walls torn down and doors opened wide. It's a story of a wild wind and tongues of holy fire that can't be kept out by a locked door on Pentecost. It's a story of prison gates that mysteriously fall open and chains that fall to the ground. It's a story of one boundary after another falling away as Peter asks, "Who are we to keep out the uncircumcised? Who are we to declare foods or people unclean?" God's love and mercy are wider than any boundary we can imagine. With this example, I've provided some messaging that this community can hold on to. A scripture reference from a familiar tradition, an image of doors open wide for a church whose front doors had been a notable identifying feature, and the phrase, "God's love and mercy are wider than any boundary we can imagine." It's at this point that I turn to the third element of agency, and I want to credit the work of Dr. Tressie McMillan Cotton for the language of agency and how it applies to the ways people engage in advocacy and resistance. Because we have been attentive to the context, and because we are crafting a succinct message for the listeners to relate to, the work of public theology becomes a matter of inviting one or two simple actions or next steps that should feel organic at this point. In Altadena, I reminded people of the keys that many of them still hold to the church and encouraged them to hold on to those keys and to not throw them away. I used the example of Peter, an imperfect and relatable figure in this telling, and I invited people into a narrative of the kind of community they are and can continue to be even before they've rebuilt their church. Here's a portion of the sermon's conclusion. For too many centuries, the church has used this power for harm. Priests and pastors, bishops and popes have invoked Jesus' words for the authority to condemn, to excommunicate, to judge, and even to kill, to bind God's mercy away from the undeserving. But the foundation of a faith born of love and incarnate in the infant child of an oppressed people unlocks a very different meaning in Jesus' invitation. There is no one undeserving of God's love, no one who deserves to be locked away from the church, away from God's mercy. The assignment is a test with another double meaning. I hope and pray that what we fasten on this earth and in our own hearts too will be things like cruelty, greed, selfishness, hopelessness. Let's lock that stuff up and throw away the key. And instead, let's use the power of our faith to loosen generosity, imagination, hospitality, solidarity. Let's hold each other accountable to unlocking even those parts of our own hearts that have become walled off, so that every time we notice ourselves tempted to exclude other voices or experiences from our consideration, we will pause and call on God to strengthen us once more, to open our hearts. This is a conclusion that a member of the community can hold on to. Open our hearts, practice generosity. It's a reminder that they have the ability to serve their community even without a building. The sermon reiterates theological themes that are already a part of their identity, but it also offers a concrete symbol for their future, keys with which to unlock doors. I didn't talk about advocacy at all in an overt way because this wasn't the right context or time. But in this case, it was also not necessary. The church is already doing social justice work, but they can't always put into words why their faith compels them to do it. So my goal is to remind people of the story they have already claimed, a public theology of justice and extravagant welcome. In settings of disaster recovery, instead of imagining public theology as a call to do more, it is possible to have a bigger impact by reflecting the church's own story back to them, to remind them that they already have the agency and the theology to be the community they hope to rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Rachel. Thank you, everyone. You have just heard from our 3 student presenters from Panel 1, Sermons as Public Theology. They have done an excellent work on sharing their work on the topic of preaching, rhetoric, and theological responsibility in public life. Now, I would like to warmly invite our faculty responder, Dr. Corwin Malcolm Davis, to offer reflections on the panel and engage these papers in conversation. Dr. Corwin, we welcome you.
Thank you, Dr. So, and thank you to these 3 wonderful panelists for their remarks on sermons as public theology. In 1979, upon hearing the news of the assassination of Harvey Milk, a San Francisco city supervisor, champion of queer rights, and namesake of our SFO airport, Holly Near penned the words of a song the night of the tragedy. As masses of people gathered in the streets of San Francisco, they would sing what she had written that night on the drive over. She wrote, "We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives. We are a gentle, angry people, and we are singing for our lives." The lyrics continue with different variations. We are a justice-seeking people. We are young and old together. We are a land of many colors. We are gay and straight together. We are a gentle, angry people. And when I think of sermons as public theology, and I distill the insights from each of these 3 exceptional paper presentations, I choose to affirm through Holly Near's words that it sometimes requires a unique balance of gentle and angry to communicate a public theological claim through proclamation. From Jayna, Lavjay, and Rachael, I hear some emerging threads and themes about power, about storytelling, and about provocations and disruptions. And I offer a few responsive words to synthesize these papers together. To begin, I use the word proclamation intentionally here to clarify in homiletical theory a distinction between preaching and proclamation. As homiletician Lisa Thompson notes, quote, "Whether it's a grandiose appearance or a hushed voice, proclamation is the moment in which the mundane has made way for what is holy, sacred, and counted as true to appear in the midst of those gathered," end quote. And according to Thompson's articulation, this marking experience rests on those gathered affirming that something meaningful has occurred. Proclamation here, as we've seen through the 3 papers, refers to that which cultivates the space for the divine to be witnessed in and among the human, and that which points us towards something we can know and feel to be true through experience. Proclamation, not reducible to preaching, moves in and through different genres and modalities of expression. As Danielle McCrae reminds us, those genres are never fixed categories. They are expanded, they're modified, they are performed in fresh ways as new voices inhabit them and as new situations arise. These three papers from the section are not only demonstrative of the panel's theme, but they also go the extra mile to include theological reasoning, rhetorical discipline, and social awareness. And they do this again, I argue, through interrogations of power, story, and provocation. Firstly, on power. As Lavjay reminded us, revisionism, especially that which reflects violence or violations, is often a negotiation at the, quote, intersections of interpretation, power, and responsibility, end quote. Lavjay's invocation of a hegemonic revisionism in particular demonstrates how the reshaping of narratives that reinforce dominant social and patriarchal structures has the capacity to shift the locus of power through public proclamation. Rachael reflects this too as she explores the power in her position as a conference minister and the authority that her language carries in that context, even if sometimes not as obvious. This evokes French post-structuralist Michel Foucault's articulation of power, when he writes, "We must cease once and for all to describe the effects of power in negative terms. It excludes, it represses, it censors, it abstracts, it masks, it conceals. In fact, power produces. It produces reality, it produces domains of objects, it produces rituals of truth. The individual and the knowledge that may be gained of him belong to this production," end quote. In other words, as these papers suggest, power is productive for narrative. It does not always yield to an a priori reality of nature, but our words and our stories can produce significant effects through the social relations of power. And by extension, our theological and religious narratives carry a deep capacity to produce, to construct, to generate, and as we've heard, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Secondly, on storytelling. Jayna's presentation reminds us that some stories are more mischievous experiments as opposed to structured arguments. And additionally, that we are not the only ones crafting stories. Or, as Rachael also claims, public theology matters when it's well received by the community, when the story that we are shaping can be picked up as a collective story for the collective to affirm. Stories and narratives, especially those of public theology, come into clearer focus when they are accepted by the social order as legible. The storied Black religious scholar Charles Long enumerates this claim in his seminal work on significations, wherein he claims that central to the social is communication. Quote, "Communication predicated on the understanding of reality as objective and cognitive, and at the same time oretic and mysterious." This is to say, as Lavjay's already reminded us, stories can be retold, reinterpreted, reimagined in order to shape meaning, to reinstantiate the inherited logics of domination, or to recast the shifting dynamics of the public landscape. Lastly, on provocation. I appreciate Jayna's invoking of Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia, so I also turn to his book to gesture toward what we in theology might refer to as an eschatological inquiry. Munoz argues that queerness is not quite here, is in the language of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, a potentiality. And this potentiality, Munoz later argues, resists the futurity that is the reproductive majoritarian heterosexuality, resists the spectacle of the state refurbishing its logics and its ranks through the acts of reproduction, and resists the anti-performativity that rhetoric is tempted to portend. Instead, Munoz argues, we look toward the unrealized potentials, the cultural surplus, the cultural and the affective not yets, the quote, forward dawning, anticipatory illuminations of the not yet conscious. Jayna herself demonstrates this through the foreplay and the thrill, through the inquiry of what is it that our words actually disrupt, and moreover, who benefits, and through the invocation of an anticipatory, masterpatological epistemology. Rachael does this through a turn toward a public theology of justice and extravagant welcome, and to imagining communities that serve without an edifice of restraint, having the ability to reflect and redirect their own story to themselves. Lavjay does this by questioning, quote, who controls the narrative anyhow? My addition. And who controls meaning making, especially when we are seeing more and more voices being silenced and more stories being revised without consent. In sum, when we think then of proclamations as public theology, we are not exclusively attending to the scriptures or to the congregations, nor are we limiting our analyses to rhetoric and performativity. We are always already equally invested in the relationships between speaker and hearer, between storyteller and community of listeners, which is to say, between the relationships of power and authority. Perhaps public theology, through sermons or writing or stories, demands something else of us. Perhaps thinking theologically in public might have to shift its nomenclature toward thinking theologically with publics. As critical theorist Judith Butler contends, quote, the public sphere is constituted in part by what cannot be said and what cannot be shown, the limits of the sayable, the limits of what can appear, circumscribe the domain in which political speech operates and certain kinds of subjects appear as visible actors, end quote. Perhaps the attendant logics of power and control that are embedded within our accounts of narrative must, as Butler teaches, attend to the sensitivity of whose stories are legible, whose stories are culturally produced as fundamentally illegible, and where and how does the divine story make space for collective proclamations? Each of these insightful papers provides a creative response to the theme of the panel, thinking broadly about the need for academic, theological thinking and writing to make its way more into communities of faith, more toward and with marginalized populations, and both to construct and deconstruct publics and counterpublics. For perhaps in the end, we are just a gentle, angry people, and we too are singing, preaching, thinking, writing for our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Appreciate your beautiful reflection, response. We will now move into the time of Q&A. We now open the space for conversation. I invite questions from our audience. Please share your questions with the host or co-host. I think also a symposium Q&A. Symposium Q&A is the place you would ask your questions, and we will pass them along to the faculty responder who will help facilitate the Q&A for each panel.
While those questions are coming in, I can pose an initial set if that is helpful, Dr. So.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Certainly. This question is in some ways to each of you, and I'll ask you maybe just to respond in 60 seconds. I know that's difficult. But through a through line through each of your papers is this question around who decides who's responsible for the stories that are being told, who decides or who's responsible for the interpretations. And so I really want to frame this first question around a question that Jayna asked that maybe she did not want to answer. But if it is ethically sound to write words in this space, a space of academics, theologians, who's responsible for how those words get out? Who's responsible for the stories that we are telling? And what responsibility do we have to our theological interpretations? Does that question make sense? In other words, what prevents us in the Theological Academy from causing the same harm? What prevents our stories from also revising the stories of others? Can we go Lavjay, Jayna, and then Rachael?
Sure, Professor Davis. My very simplistic or maybe simple response to that would be an appreciation that there is no single story, that there are multiple stories, and to always be cognizant and aware of the fact that we can create a space where every single story is welcomed and encouraged to be spoken. So everyone has the power in my mind and should have the power and use that power.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks, Lavjay. Jayna.
You're right. I don't want to answer the question. I don't have words that fit well into it. And I think words and the structure, the way that we structure words and arguments is a big, enormous part of the issue. I don't know if problem's the right word. That there is this that we break things down into these categories and then say this is the correct way to present these words and these categories and these arguments. And when I problematized the idea of epistemologies not being consensual, I didn't necessarily have a solution, but I think also the idea of problem and solution is part of the problem. Like just the way that we think about these things is problematic in the structures that we have. And I don't know how to think differently because this is how my brain has been bonsaied into thinking about things.
Excellent response, Jayna. Thank you. Rachael.
I want to cautiously say that I think we're moving away from the idea that it is possible to not do harm. I think the answer is we can't. We will certainly do harm. And so rather than say, how can we do this in a way that doesn't harm, we're saying like, how can we do the least harm? How can we be gentle with what we're sharing? And also that at some level, like, who are we responsible to? Who gets to hold the responsible? I think in some ways, Lavjay's story, it's like, well, who's responsible? Which narrative? Who gets to tell the story? Amplifying one voice might do harm to another, or at least a person might perceive something as harmful, even if it's not intended to be harmful. As people who have a lot of privilege lose that privilege, that could be perceived as harm. Is it harm just because they perceive it to be harmful? So I think we're really asking these questions around, can we not do harm? And so is it better to just say like, this might hurt a little bit, but it's for the building up and healing. Healing is a painful process sometimes too. So that's a very difficult thing to answer in 60 seconds.
Yes, you've all done so well. And you're getting to where I hoped you would, which is that there's some kind of inherent limitations to this work, right? That there's Jayna, your point around how we can structurally conceive or derive an argument, even the very logics of language, right, are I'm thinking here about kind of psychoanalysis, right? That there's that language itself brings us out of the real into the symbolic order. There's no way we're not structured in kind of caught up in the matrices. And then yes, similarly, like Rachael lifted up, that means there's some ways in which we can't excuse or eliminate the potential for harm or for retelling or mistelling or mishearing a story. Yeah, that was great. I have a second question for each of you, and you can take more than 60 seconds. I'm going to a question that Rachael posed, which is this distinction between pastoral and public sensitivity. So the broad question is, within public theologies or within public kind of religious thinking, however broadly we're thinking around it, where do you, for yourself or for your community, discern the distinction between public and private, between what others might call pastoral or prophetic, which is another way to say, how do we discern for ourselves which stories to share, which stories to write about, speak about, talk about, and which ones do we withhold, which ones do we keep close? And I'll allow you to answer that in any order that feels natural.
I'll start off by jumping in with a couple of observations. One is that I think this question in the actual experience of preaching and being with communities that are worshiping in 2026 in Southern California is that most of these stories are being shared already in a very public context because of the introduction of live streaming or otherwise publicly sharing worship. So that's a separate challenge, right? And even the way that people choose to engage in worship differently, knowing that their engagement is being live streamed, like that's a whole multiple course. Many panels could address those questions. So I think sometimes the decisions around what stories we share and don't share is more around a sense of like some of these stories have already been shared publicly. So how do we help continue to provide a container for them and frame them? I think sometimes people share things and then later realize, oh my gosh, that's so much more public than I intended it to be. So how do we, again, around the question of harm, help create a way to give people a core message or narrative to hang on to say, it was okay that I shared this story. This is what I did in sharing my story. Others also relate to or empathize with this story. So sort of like it's already been done, the sharing has already happened. How do we help kind of nurture a positive sense of what it meant to share that story? And that's the piece that I referenced from Tressie McMillan Cottom, her speaking about agency, and in particular this idea that people are tired not because we are doing too much or trying to do too much, but actually because we're doing too little. And it's not that we aren't, it's not number of hours or number of, emails or calls to your legislator or whatever that you're doing. It's that what we are doing can feel ineffective. And when we feel like what we're doing is effective, it doesn't make us tired. It gives us energy. It gives us agency. And so I think, again, helping these stories that are already out there, framing them with agency will give people more confidence about the sharing of them. And so I think sometimes pastorally, my responsibility is to say, the story is already out there. It's already been shared publicly. But how can I give you a framework that will help this story feel agentic for you instead of feeling like something that's out there that can do harm to you?
Yeah, thank you. Lavjay or Jayna?
I would say, yeah, I rely a lot on frameworks whenever I am struggling to decide if I should say something, when I should say something or not. And so a framework that I've often relied on is the tenets of mindful communication, asking myself, is it true? Is it well intended and is it kind? And so the intention is always something which I need to reflect on. What am I trying to achieve? And then the last thing is it the right time and the right place for me to say it? And so those are sort of just foundational elements that help me decide whether the context and the audience is right for me to say something or not.
Yeah, thanks, Lavjay.
So I'm a wild woman, and I'm always shocked that my community hands me the microphone over and over again because I don't have great skills with filters or knowing what the right thing to say is in any given room. That's never been part of what I was good at. But I think one of the things that I lean into in this season, and I am giving the Eastern sermon this Sunday, and I'm like, what am I supposed to say? Because the things I want to say, I'm also aware are oftentimes really upsetting or disruptive and uncomfortable. And I think one of the things somebody said at PSR, somebody said this in my first semester, and I wish I remembered who. They said, who's going to carry the weight
Hmm.
of this statement, of this theology? And I always keep that in mind. And if it's somebody who I think is more vulnerable and ought not have that weight, I will say it in a way that I think, or I don't say it at all. But if it's people who have more privilege or people who might be able to carry that weight in this season, then I do say it. And I think that is kind of the intuitive framework. But I think I make lots of mistakes as I go. And then I get people who, let me know. So
Yes, thank you. I think you all lift up one thread. We're at time, I believe, but you bring up a thread too around this distinction between what is already public, kind of what's already been talked about, versus what we're lifting up, what we're mining. This takes me back to Lavjay, your distinction between hermeneusis and revisionism, right? Whether we're interpreting what's already happening or kind of reshaping or retelling, providing a new lens on a different story. Which, to your point, Jayna, sometimes can be disruptive and can cause provocations. and perhaps that's part of our task. Thank you each for your very, very generative papers, for your thoughtful writing, and for your excellence in academics today. We're grateful.